You've all been sitting for a long time. Come on, stand up, please. And exercise yourself. Maybe what I do when I teach at UCLA is I say to the students, repeat after me. Just because it is this way doesn't mean it has to stay this way. All right, that was too soft, but you did a good job. You could shake and wiggle and do whatever you want at this point, but I'm Dick Jackson. I'm going to be talking about how the built environment shakes our health. Please go ahead and sit down or stand if you want to continue to do it. I've been to Pittsburgh about 15 times. I don't think I've been so excited about a meeting in such a long time. What an amazing morning. Pittsburgh feels a lot like my hometown of Newark, New Jersey. My best friend going through grammar school was a kid named Bobby. I won't say his last name, but he was terrific. He was a good writer. He was very smart. He's a good ball player. But he had a trait that I didn't find very easy. He had a terrible temper. And I discovered by the time we were in about second or third grade that he and I had a lot in common. His mother had died of brain tumor when he was in kindergarten, and I think maybe that was something of his temper. And my own father had died of polio when I was 3. The man had been a fighter pilot. He was a tough guy. And so we had a lot in common, but we stayed friends all through. About 7th grade, he called me up one morning and he said, Mick, my father died. And I was like stunned. And of course, the next several days were frightening, and you know what it's like when you're 12 years old and you have to go to the funeral home, the wake, and here's Bobby standing there in his suit all alone, greeting people as they came in, and it was just heartbreaking. And another family took care of him, but this experience of having people die in their 40s and 50s and early 60s of heart disease was so common, and I think a lot of people in this room remember that very, very clearly. And the epidemic of heart disease in the United States, which is stunning, that curve on the top is heart disease. Look at that epidemic. You know, anytime something's going up like that, the leading cause of death, there is something in the environment that is causing this epidemic. And there was something in the environment. And we felt it was insurmountable. And so the medical institutions began to come up with better medicines to treat hypertension and eventually to do heart surgeries and transplants and CABG surgeries and stents. And we began to see a decline in the death rate of heart disease. It's fallen by more than 1/3. And if you go over to the medical center, they're going to take credit for it. But the truth is, what happened, this was an environmentally induced disease. It was the change in environmentally causes in the environment. Number one, the biggest killer was smoking. And it took much better science, but then beginning to educate our population, particularly our young people, about the importance of avoiding this killer. 2 was changing the environment, the living environment. I remember saying to my son about 15 years ago, when you were little, they used to smoke on airplanes, and he was very skeptical. He said, Dad, you're crazy. You know, people never could smoke on airplanes. I said, no, this was the norm. Every building that had smoking, every office people were smoking. Complete environmental change. But the big environment change, and we've seen dramatic reductions in air pollution levels. And those little tiny particles that we can't see of soot, when I was in training, they told us, that's bad for your lungs. It wasn't until the last 10 years we discovered, no, it's not just bad for your lungs. Those particles go straight through your alveoli, into your bloodstream, into your heart, raise your risks of angina, heart disease, and heart attacks, and stroke. So we actually cured an environmentally induced epidemic. And so lifespans have increased in the United States. And you can see that curve of just since the time that Bobby's dad died, that we've added about 10 years to the average American lifespan. Wow, this is great. And you go over to the medical center. I'm at UCLA, and there's a big sign outside of UCLA Medical Center. We've done 8,000 lung transplants. And, they think that all the improvement in health has come from this. In fact, we have added 30 years to the American lifespan during the 20th century, How many of those years do you think came from medical care? The 30 years. If I ask the docs, they'll all say, oh, all of them. In fact, only 5 years came from medical care. The other 25 came from the two big I's: infrastructure and immunization. Now, I teach at UCLA, and the fancy parents over in Santa Monica don't want their children immunized. They're very foolish. If you've been around a child with whooping cough or seen a child with measles encephalitis left permanently retarded, it is ridiculous that people would be opposed to immunization. I'm passionate about that. But the other big I was infrastructure. It was changing the physical environment, dealing with air pollution, dealing with water quality, dealing with safer workplaces, healthier food. That's where the other 25 years of human health improvement came from. And so we've made great progress in the United States, except if you look at that slide a little more closely, this is from the World Bank, there are a bunch of other countries that the improvement in health has been far more dramatic than our well-loved United States of America. Look how fast, you can't read the details, but these are countries far less wealthy than we are, much more dramatic and rapid improvements in lifespan. In fact, we're quite a bit lower than most of the countries on that chart. I put this slide in part because Pittsburgh is really challenged with air pollution issues even today. You're number 23 of all 3,300 counties in the United States in terms of negative air quality, ozone and particulates. And that's really very worrisome because, as I said, these particles get in your... Well, this is insurmountable. We need this for our industry. Well, Los Angeles, they couldn't land airplanes during the 1950s at LAX sometimes because the smog was so bad. And they had to ratchet down both the car emissions, that was a catalytic converter, but they had to ratchet down the stuff coming out of fixed sources and industrial sources as well. Well, so what? You know, all this stuff is far away. Well, my friends at USC do these lung function studies of kids in the schools, and during the late 1990s, they were looking how many kids in the schools in Los Angeles had impaired lung function. And it was somewhere in the range of 6, 7, 8% of all the kids had impaired lung function. Well, so what, you know, but you're never going to be a superstar athlete. And how good your lungs are at age 23 in many ways predicts how long you're going to live, because we decrement by about a 1 or 2% each year. So Los Angeles, we ended up having to really ratchet down the particulates in the air, and just over the course of a dozen years, reduce the particulate levels down by 47%. Look what happened to lung function. Down now, only about 4% of the kids have impaired lung function. How many more athletes do we get out of that? How many more years of life do we get? This early life experience, we go on in our lives carrying these burdens. And our poorest neighborhoods consistently have the worst air pollution. This is down near the port of Los Angeles. But one of the things that's striking isn't simply our hearts, but these particles in the air also reduce our brain development, the white matter in our brain and the progression in our brain. So these are things we carry for a long time. And this is stuff that we begin to see manifest even as we get older in lives. So here is the expenditures. Oh, the bottom of that chart was how much money each of the countries was spending in order to get more years of life and on medical care. And this is the chart I really want to show you. The countries on the left. So we Americans live on average to about 78 years old and spend close to $10,000 per person on medical care. We live about as long as the people in Chile who spend $2,000 per person on medical care. Now, if I walked up and said to one of you, how come we're spending so much money on medical care and we're not much better than we are, you'd say, greedy drug companies, greedy doctors, and greedy this. Part of it's technology, but part of it is we're underinvesting in prevention. Now, the big problem, and one of the things I worry about most, and we haven't really touched on it yet, is the avalanche of chronic diseases. And all day yesterday I was at the Institute of Medicine, and the Secretary General of the World Health Organization was there presenting similar issues to this about what we're worried about worldwide. And one of the biggest, most threatening issues is the epidemic of obesity. Here's the obesity map in the United States in 1990. Pennsylvania is probably at about, 10% of the population obese in 1990. I went to CDC in 1994. We were just beginning to see the surge in obesity in the United States. Pennsylvania is now up to, cut off the bottom, but probably about 14%. Here's the year 2000. Pennsylvania is at about 24% of your population being obese. And here's today. 2016, Pennsylvania is now at about 34% of your population is obese. The whole country. So about 1/3 of all of our adults in the United States are obese. An additional third are overweight. And now the numbers of people that are what we used to call morbidly obese and severely obese have climbed dramatically. And this is a big problem because it raises our risk of cancer, of pancreatic disease, of bad joints, of amputation, and other issues as well. It's very, very expensive. But here's the thing that we worry about most in the medical world, is the obesity epidemic is inevitably coupled with a diabetes epidemic. And the blue line, or the teal line, is the increase in your risk of developing the disease diabetes if you're a woman. The other line is the risk if you're a man. Look how dramatically increased a woman who is in a level of severe obesity has almost 100 times the risk of getting this disease. So what do you think the maps of the United States look like in 1995? Here's diabetes in 1995. Here's diabetes in 2003. And here's diabetes in the United States today. So walk down the street in town now, and 15% of the adults that you see have a disease that will cost them their eyes, retinopathy, their kidneys, nephropathy, their feet, gangrene, and eventually, of course, their hearts. This feels as insurmountable as the heart disease epidemic. And so how do we begin to think about turning this one around? And as we think about empowerment, this is the most disempowering thing I can think about, is to be this level of illness. I'm a pediatrician. In my training, I remember going to the children's diabetes clinic. And it was all kids with what we used to call juvenile diabetes. Now we call it type 1. It's probably an autoimmune disease where the cells of the pancreas are being damaged by your immunity. If you walk into that clinic today, half the children have what we used to call adult onset diabetes, obesity related. And I'm not making this up, you see 16-year-olds with diseases of 60-year-olds, heart failure, liver failure, fatty liver. You'd think they were alcoholics sometimes. There's so much fat in their liver related to these disorders. This, too, is an environmentally induced disease. It is the larger advertising environment. Turn on the Super Bowl, and major soda companies are spending $75,000 a second to tell our children to consume large amounts of sugar. And by the way, the next ad that comes on is a major car company saying, sit on your behind an hour and a half a day and don't get enough physical exercise during that same period of time. So in another way, this is an environmentally induced disease. We've removed physical activity and then we've saturated the diet, where the average American kid, a lot of them are getting 1,000 more calories a week than they have the opportunity to burn. And that's a very dangerous situation. So the Institute of Medicine was asked, how do we turn around the obesity epidemic? And they came up with 24 different recommendations about how we're going to end this avalanche of obesity going on in the United States and other parts of the world. And as you think about rebuilding Pittsburgh, I want you to remember this one. Please, make physical activity an integral and routine part of life. Communities, transportation officials, planners, health professionals, and governments need to make promotion of physical activity a priority by increasing access to these places. When I lived in Atlanta and I was working at CDC, Joan and I have 3 sons. They're grown now, but if I wanted to go to a park, half the parks in Atlanta you couldn't get into. Can you imagine if you were a poor African-American family? You could not get into the park unless you had a car, just because of the way it was designed. Oldest son was a long-distance runner, and there was no place for him to run because there weren't any sidewalks near where we lived in Atlanta. And so over and over again, we made the decision that the entire city was being built for cars and not for the needs of human beings. And there's a lesson I'll put at the end about what we build. We build subdivisions, and when earlier speaker was talking about the emptying out of this city with the complete paving over, large-scale paving over of the city, lots of parking spaces, people moved to suburbs like this. Imagine you were an 8-year-old girl living at the top of that cul-de-sac up there, and you wanted to see your best friend who lived 50 yards away. You could, climb over the fence and pass the Doberman and the Rottweiler and the pervert and the guy with the gun, and then go to the house up at the top. But you were more likely to say what? Mom, drive me. And so for many parents in America, the job has become to be the chauffeur for the kids. When I was growing up in Newark, I couldn't imagine ever asking my mother to make me a play date. And yet this is the condition that so many of us are in. The other aspect of all this paving over, remember I talked about right now, food that tastes good, that lasts a long time on the shelves, has lots of calories and is very cheap. And the stuff that is more expensive doesn't last as long and is fresher and healthier for us. But one of the reasons is we have paved over some of the finest farmland in the world. So Bucks County, they're putting in these huge car auction lots and other things on land that was got 50 feet of topsoil and could grow any crop you wanted. So we've lost land that we really needed for having high quality food. I took this picture in Atlanta, and it looks like a joke, and it is a bit of a joke, but there's a message underneath this, which is the most discriminated against people, and I will argue, you may argue with me on this one, but I would argue that one of the most disenfranchised people in America are people who don't drive. And 1/3 of our population doesn't drive. They're too old, they're too young, they're too poor, they're disabled. And so we build America for the 2/3 of the people who can drive, and we don't remember anybody who can't drive. And so sidewalks become the responsibility of the homeowner. So here in Atlanta, the homeowner put in the sidewalk but couldn't be bothered connecting to anything else. And the same people would complain about potholes don't worry about the fact that the one thing that we need to be doing to deal with the obesity epidemic, to deal with the diabetes epidemic, is to walk 10,000 steps a day. If you already have type 2 diabetes, 10,000 steps a day will reduce your risk of diabetes by about 58% in progressing, and doubles your survival. There's no drug that works as well as physical activity. Even a little physical activity and exercise and walking is better for it. So anytime we remove walking from the human experience, we're depriving people of life and freedom, and I think in some ways happiness. I took this picture last night as I was walking over. By the way, in New York, this would be illegal. You cannot block sidewalks. It doesn't matter what kind of construction you're doing. You either get a permit and you run a covered pathway, or they put the covered pathway, the industrialized pathway, all along the sidewalk. Pedestrians should not be second-rate citizens. When we build, we should put people first. Imagine you moved into this subdivision and you're a new mom and you've got a 5-month-old and you hardly know anybody, and you make friends with the person on the other side of the fence, and they're really nice, and Halloween's coming up, and you say, oh, well, let's take the kids out. We'll go trick-or-treating. We have these cute costumes. And you say, okay, come on over, and we'll have a little bit of a party, and then we'll go trick-or-treating. And you say, well, it's only 35 feet away, but there's a fence, and I actually don't know how to get there. I'll Google it, and I'll figure out how to visit my new friend. And if you go to Google, it's 7 miles away in 17 minutes in the car. And this is a true story, but underneath this joke is that when we build, we think about human beings and human needs last. And so a big takeaway is put people people first, not cars. Sitting in a car is not good for you. Driving raises your blood pressure, your cholesterol, your blood sugar, your cortisol levels. Your risk of having a heart attack goes up during that time and actually tapers down for about the hour or two afterwards. In fact, where I live in Atlanta, every meeting starts with the morning meeting starts with the following statement. No, when I live in LA, I'm sorry I was late. There was a wreck on something or other, because just depending on cars. I love the video, by the way, that Andre showed, because we all thought that sitting in the car was going to fix everything. Now we all think autonomous cars are going to fix everything. I don't think so. So we need to fix this from the top down, and getting the mortgage companies and the Federal Reserve to really think about how to give loans, and that we need to create diverse kinds of housing and housing settlements with the services that people need. We need to do it from bottom up with very strong community activism, demanding no community should have something imposed on them. They should participate in the decision. But demanding to keep the status quo is a failure. We've got to, and President Kennedy said this, the only thing we know for sure is change. We've got to embrace the change and take control of it rather than having it happen to us. And Angela's earlier comment was right. But in between are the developers. And so I'm working hard with the housing developers on principles for building healthy places. And here are 10 principles, and maybe there's only 2 that I might ask you to remember. One is to put people first as you think about what you want to build. Yes, return on investment's important, but it ought to be a very long-term return on investment, not a quick bounce back of money. And number 5, make healthy choices easy. So when I walk into a building at UCLA and I'm directed straight to the elevator and the stairways are dirty, dark, and smelly, I'm more likely to take the elevator. But as we build new buildings, and this is happening more and more, they need to be welcoming in terms of physical activity. Make the healthy choices easy. So the biggest takeaway I want to really offer you is the environment around us, the physical environment, the built environment, is social policy in concrete. And what we build is a product of our imagination and our belief systems, and we then create environments that last for 100 years. And so the world we are giving our children and our grandchildren needs to be one that makes it easy for them to be healthy and opens up these opportunities and offers them life, freedom, and happiness. Thank you very much.